In the early 1930s, Germany looked like a country in free fall. Factories stood silent. Banks trembled. Millions of workers, many of them veterans, walked the streets with nowhere to go and no future to trust. Then something happened that still shocks historians and economists. In just a few years, unemployment collapsed. Production surged. Highways appeared. Industry roared back to life. And to many ordinary people, it felt like a miracle. A modern viewer might ask the obvious question, was it real? Was it sustainable? Or was it the most expensive illusion in modern history? An economy rebuilt not to create prosperity, but to create power. Because this is the uncomfortable truth. Nazi Germany's economy did not rise to feed its people. It rose to feed a war machine. And the same mechanisms that created the appearance of recovery, hidden debt, forced mobilization, propaganda, and a hunger for resources, also contained the seeds of collapse. This is the story of how an economy can be turned into a weapon, and what happens when that weapon runs out of fuel. To understand the rise, we have to begin with the damage. After World War I, Germany was not just defeated, it was destabilized. The new republic, Weimar Germany, was born in humiliation and political violence. Confidence in the state was fragile, and trust in institutions was fragile. And when trust is fragile, economics becomes emotional. Money becomes fear. Work becomes identity. And every crisis becomes a referendum on whether the system deserves to survive. Germany experienced severe shocks in the early 1920s, including hyperinflation that burned itself into national memory. Even when the currency stabilized later, the psychological scar remained. A society that has watched money lose meaning does not easily believe in tomorrow again. Then came the global crash. In 1929, the world economy cracked, and Germany, highly dependent on international capital flows, was hit brutally. By the early 1930s, unemployment surged into the millions. This was not a normal recession. It felt like a permanent shutdown of the future. In that environment, people were not only looking for jobs, they were looking for certainty. And certainty is the most valuable currency extremist politics can print. When the Nazis rose politically, they did not campaign like a government planning genocide and war. They campaigned like a movement promising stability. They offered a story that felt simple. Germany was betrayed. Germany was humiliated. Germany was starving while others grew rich. And Germany needed discipline. The promise was not only economic, it was psychological, work, order, pride, national rebirth. But behind the rhetoric was a crucial shift. The state would no longer be just a referee of the economy. It would become the driver, the director, the planner, and eventually, the owner of outcomes. A free economy can be slow to respond to disaster, but a command-driven economy can create the appearance of speed, especially when it does not care about civil liberties, unions, independent institutions, or long-term costs. So the first secret of the Nazi recovery is simple. A dictatorship can force motion. The harder question is what kind of motion it forces, and what it destroys in the process. In the early years after 1933, the regime pushed job creation and public works. There were construction projects, infrastructure, and a surge in state direction. But here's what matters. Some of the unemployment reduction was real. Some was manipulated. The regime reduced unemployment statistics by expanding conscription and military-related employment, and by excluding groups they did not want counted or employed. And the economy's recovery was also helped by a broader global stabilization in the mid-1930s. But Nazi propaganda framed it as a singular miracle, a miracle made by a singular leader. That framing is part of the economic mechanism, because once a population believes one leader restored dignity, they become more willing to accept sacrifices for the nation. They accept wage controls. They accept limits on labor rights. They accept price controls. They accept rationing later. And most dangerously, they accept the idea that the economy exists for the state, not the other way around. In other words, the economic recovery did not merely employ workers. It trained obedience. If you strip away the speeches, the core driver of Nazi economic expansion was rearmament. Factories were not merely reopened. They were redirected. Steel, chemicals, vehicles, aviation, entire sectors were shaped around military demand. This creates a powerful short-term stimulus. When a government orders massive production, money flows into industry quickly. Jobs appear quickly. But rearmament is not like building a normal consumer economy. A consumer economy creates products that raise living standards. Rearmament creates products designed to be destroyed. A tank does not feed a family. A bomber does not build long-term prosperity. So how do you pay for an economy that produces weapons at scale, especially when you are trying to hide how much you are spending? That brings us to one of the most important financial tricks of the regime. Rearmament had a problem. It was expensive, and it was politically risky. Germany was still bound by restrictions and scrutiny, and open deficits could trigger alarms, at home and abroad. So the regime used creative financing. A scheme widely discussed by historians is the use of Mefo bills associated with Hjalmar Schacht. In simple terms, it was a way to finance rearmament through a shadow instrument, creating obligations that could circulate and be discounted while concealing the true scale of government spending. Think of it like this. Instead of the state openly borrowing huge sums in the normal way, it created a mechanism that delayed the moment when the bill became visible. It pushed the cost into the future. It made the present look stable, but the future was being loaded with explosives. This is a classic pattern in unsustainable systems, short-term stability purchased by long-term fragility. And the fragility increased because the spending was not aimed at productive consumer growth. It was aimed at war readiness. So even as people felt life improving, jobs, motion, pride, the economy was becoming structurally dependent on militarization. If rearmament slowed, the engine would stall. If war did not come, the debt and resource pressures would surface. And if war did come, the economy would need to feed an expanding military appetite. In other words, the system had only one direction: forward, faster, or collapse. A major part of this story is labor. In a normal democracy, labor has bargaining power through unions, strikes, and elections. In Nazi Germany, independent unions were crushed. The regime created structures that looked like labor organization, but functioned as control. Wages were constrained. Workers had fewer rights to negotiate, and the state increasingly managed labor allocation. In the short run, this can reduce industrial conflict and stabilize production. In the long run, it turns human beings into inputs. And once people are treated as inputs, the logic of exploitation becomes easier to expand, especially during war. The regime also pursued social policies designed to control consumption, encouraging savings, limiting imports, prioritizing strategic materials. To many ordinary Germans, it felt like discipline for national recovery. But discipline was not the end. It was preparation. Germany faced a hard reality. It lacked many critical raw materials: oil, certain ores, rubber, and modern war is a war of logistics. You do not win with ideology. You win with fuel, steel, transport, and supply. So the regime pursued autarky, economic self-sufficiency, not because self-sufficiency is efficient, but because self-sufficiency is strategic when you expect blockade and war. This is where the economy becomes even more war-shaped. The goal is no longer to trade peacefully for resources. The goal is to reduce dependence, substitute materials, and prepare for isolation. And that brings us to a major shift in 1936. In 1936, the regime launched what became known as the Four-Year Plan, an aggressive attempt to make the armed forces ready and the economy ready for war within 4 years. This is not subtle. This is war planning in economic form. The plan pushed rearmament harder and pushed autarky harder. It emphasized synthetic substitutes, like synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel, because Germany feared being cut off from global supplies. It also expanded state intervention across industries, and it elevated political power over economic rationality, because when an economy is built for war, efficiency becomes secondary to control. You might waste resources, but you gain command. You might distort prices, but you gain direction. You might impoverish consumers, but you gain tanks. This is also where certain industrial giants expanded dramatically under the regime's strategic priorities. For example, IG Farben played a major role in developing synthetic rubber, Buna, and other chemical industrial substitutes tied to autarky and rearmament logic. In this phase, the economy's rise becomes more extreme, but it also becomes more brittle, because autarky is costly, synthetic substitutes are expensive, and the more you force the economy away from market signals, the more hidden stress accumulates. By the late 1930s, Germany was already showing signs of overheating. Shortages, foreign exchange constraints, pressure on consumer goods. A state can silence complaints, but it cannot cheat physics. War requires inputs, and Germany needed more than it had. So the economy turned outward. When war began, Nazi Germany did not merely fight for ideology. It fought for resources. War becomes an economic strategy. Seize what you lack, exploit labor, confiscate food, redirect industrial output, and this is where the rise is sustained temporarily by theft. Occupied territories were forced into economic service, factories were redirected, raw materials extracted, and labor was coerced, often brutally. This is not an accidental byproduct. It is the logic of an economy that has built itself around the need to keep rearmament running. If your internal economy cannot sustainably support your military machine, you either slow down or you take from others. The regime chose to take. But plunder is not stable growth. It is a temporary injection. It creates resistance, sabotage, and administrative complexity. It also creates moral collapse, which in turn fuels further violence to maintain control. So the economy becomes trapped. It must expand to survive. And expansion increases the enemies trying to destroy it. As the war expanded, the economy shifted further into total mobilization. More production for arms, more control over labor, more rationing, and increasingly more reliance on forced labor. This is a crucial point. Forced labor can increase output in the short term, but it is economically inefficient in human terms. It requires coercion, It breeds sabotage. It reduces morale. It creates administrative costs. And it destroys the legitimacy of the system forever. But a dictatorship at war may not care about legitimacy. It cares about output. So the economy becomes morally bankrupt and mechanically dependent on oppression. Meanwhile, another challenge grew larger: fuel, transportation, and the vulnerability of infrastructure to bombing. In many narratives, Albert Speer appears as the technocrat who increased armaments production after he gained power over war production. There were real efforts at centralization and rationalization, standardization, prioritization, reducing competing bureaucracies. And German war production did surge in certain periods. But here is the reality behind the numbers. An economy can produce more weapons right before it collapses. In fact, collapse often creates desperate efficiency. When your system is under existential threat, it strips away luxury. It forces concentration on core outputs. So rising production figures do not always indicate health. Sometimes they indicate a system burning its remaining oxygen. And the oxygen was running out, because the Allies learned where the war economy was most vulnerable. Not in slogans, not in speeches, in fuel. Modern mechanized war runs on petroleum. A tank without fuel is a metal box. An aircraft without fuel is grounded. Transport without fuel collapses. Germany's fuel situation was always a strategic weakness. It relied heavily on synthetic fuel production and limited sources, making it vulnerable. And the Allied bombing effort increasingly targeted oil infrastructure, refineries, synthetic fuel plants, storage, and transport networks. When oil production and distribution are hit, the effects ripple through everything. Factories cannot receive inputs. Armies cannot maneuver. Training declines. Air defense weakens. Repair becomes harder. And even if you still have workers and machines, you cannot convert them into effective military power without energy. This is one of the clearest fall mechanisms. The economy was built to feed war, and war exposed the economy's dependence on fragile energy systems. By 1944, the cumulative pressure, bombing, resource scarcity, frontline losses began to crush the system. As bombing intensified and the war turned against Germany, transport networks degraded. Rail lines, bridges, marshalling yards, factories themselves, cities suffered enormous destruction. At this stage, even if the state orders production, production cannot simply happen, because production is a chain. Raw materials must arrive, parts must move, electricity must flow, workers must eat and sleep. A war economy under bombardment becomes a survival economy, and survival economies shrink psychologically. People stop thinking about victory. They start thinking about bread, coal, warmth, children. The regime responded with more coercion, more propaganda, more punishment. But coercion cannot rebuild a destroyed network. It can only force people to pretend it still works. And by late 1944 into 1945, the pretending collapsed. In the end, the Nazi economic system collapsed because its core model was unsustainable. It was built on hidden debt and financial tricks to accelerate rearmament, autarky strategies that were costly and incomplete, aggressive expansion and plunder to steal resources, coercion and forced labor to sustain output, and a war that eventually turned the industrial heartland into a target. When the military situation collapsed, the economy did not merely slow, it fractured. Local shortages became catastrophic, production became chaotic, transport collapsed, Authority disintegrated, and the illusion of national strength gave way to rubble. This is the point many people misunderstand. The Nazi economy did not fail because it was too ambitious. It failed because it was built with the wrong purpose. It was not designed to generate broad prosperity. It was designed to generate military power. And military power is a furnace. It consumes resources. It consumes lives. And eventually, it consumes the society that feeds it. So what is the lesson of this story? It is not that economic growth is dangerous. It is that growth can be manufactured in ways that hide its true cost. A dictatorship can create the appearance of recovery by forcing jobs, forcing production, and forcing unity. But if the recovery is anchored in militarization, coercion, and hidden liabilities, it is not recovery. It is mobilization. And mobilization always demands an enemy, because the system needs fear to justify sacrifice. It needs propaganda to justify control, and it needs expansion to justify its own hunger for resources. The rise is real, because motion is real, but the fall is built into the rise, because you cannot build a lasting economy on weapons, oppression, and theft. Eventually, the bill arrives, and history collects it without mercy. If you want the next episode, we can follow what happened after the collapse, how Europe rebuilt, how economic institutions changed, and why the memory of the 1930s still shapes policy today. Subscribe if you want documentary-style history told through real systems. Money, labor, propaganda, and power. Because history is not only what armies did, it's what economies made possible.